on discussing autism spectrum disorder in ICD11, a critical reflection of its possible impact on clinical practice and research for molecular psychiatry article. So I just got up to the bit where it says that in ICD11, autism can hardly be measured objectively, as the criteria contain many vague concepts, e.g. compensation, and symptoms that are only apparent in retrospect. So that means, by the way, where, say, someone might say, talk about maybe prior symptoms that they no longer have, but it can be quite hard to, if there's no observable current symptoms, then that can result in some degree of speculation and subjectivity. Unlike in the DSM, there's no mandatory features of social communication. No mandatory features of social communication or interaction are defined. Now, with the introduction of the DSM-5, a time criterion for the onset of first symptoms of ASD is relinquished. So in the previous criteria, there was an actual time criterion that said the symptoms had to emerge. I can't remember by what date. I think in a very early childhood period or something. I can't remember, but there was a time criterion, and that time criterion has now been got rid of. I disagree with that because that's going to result in a number of false positives. Because basically ASD is a disorder of early infancy, essentially. So, like, there should at least be some symptoms by the age of 3. In most cases, there will be. And, yeah, so that's problematic, I would say. But the DSM-5 states if any reports... But the DSM-5 does state that if there's any reports from parents or other caregivers that the individual had ordinary and sustained reciprocal friendships and good non-verbal communication skills during childhood, that would exclude the diagnosis of ASD. So DSM-5 is quite clear on that. But the ICD11 does not include any such hints. Now that's dodgy. In contrast, many passages suggest an ASD diagnosis might be reasonable even in the absence of defined behavioural symptoms. For example, it says that some with ASD are able to function adequately in many contexts through exceptional effort, such that their deficits may not be apparent to others, and that it says a diagnosis is still appropriate in such cases. And this can lead to non-falsifiable diagnosis. In other words, in science, you have to be able to falsify something, you have to be able to show under what grounds something can be falsified. But, something that, in other words, a non-falsifiable diagnosis is a circular diagnosis. It's just based upon, subjective say-so without any objective criterion upon which it can be measured and proven to be false. Now, that is not scientific, so that's dodgy. As it annuls the significance and accessibility of any observable features for ASD. So, in other words, someone, could turn up and claim that no one has seen any deficits, that they do function fine, that, maybe it results in burnout and extreme stress, but nobody notices their deficits. They're still able to do all of that stuff, and they could still end up getting a diagnosis. But that's problematic because lots of other conditions can also result in such stress. And also, of course, got to remember that just living in 21st century capitalist society for a lot of people is deeply tiring and stressful. So there could be many reasons for finding life exhausting. That in and of itself does not mean someone is autistic. And I mean, if no one notices the deficits at all, if you're asking me, that's kind of problematic because, yes, it's true that we do mask, that autistic can and do mask to some extent, and that might mean that, say, like a casual acquaintance might not necessarily notice, but, people who are close to you, like family, parents and stuff like that, are going to notice. If no one notices at all, if there's no history of anyone noticing, like in my case, teachers noticed, obviously they didn't pick up autism and I wasn't diagnosed until I was 21, but they noticed, they noticed the signs, they just didn't label it at the time as autism, but the signs were noticed. But what I'm saying is, if no deficits have been noticed by anyone, teachers, parents, people who are with you for a long, who are close to you, well, that's non-falsifiable, because that's just dodgy, guys, There's got to be some signs there at some point, So it says, in contrast to DSM-5, the ICD11 has no specifier for severity Maybe the reason for this was that the severity metric has shown questionable validity. So in DSM-5, you have levels, level 1, level 2, level 3, based upon support needs. That is quite questionable, but I won't go into that now. ICD11 doesn't have these levels. So one reason for that is maybe that they have questionable validity, or that in a conceptualisation of ASD in ICD11, severity in a sense of impairments in functionality do not need to be present, as implied in a statement that some are able to function adequately in many contexts through exceptional effort, and that the deficits may not be apparent to others. Now, that, as I said, that's very concerning, because one of the major criterions historically for diagnosing autism and to separate it out from normality is that there has to be a significant impairment. So it's not just about having traits, because lots of non-autistics have the traits. Lots of geeky kind of introverted types have the traits. The traits in and of themselves don't make someone autistic. It's the quality of the trait, so not just having the traits, but for quality, there's an actual qualitative feel to it that a clinician can pick up. They have to begin in early childhood, but they have to be causing really significant problems. It's not just having the traits, they have to actually impair you. Otherwise, that's not autism. That's just one-of-the-mill eccentricity, or border phenotype or subclinical that lots of people have. So that's problematic. A lot of other mental disorders are named as prominent or presenting features of ASD, for example, anxiety, school refusal, etc., and this could lead to misinterpretations of differential diagnosis as ASD. And compensation is mentioned, but there's no agreed definition. This is a speculative hypothesis, and this could result in quasi-autism, because empirical evidence around compensation is questionable. Compensation, by the way, isn't just masking. Compensation is a lot deeper. It's where a person can so overcome any traits that no one notices. That to me is very questionable. It's also the ICD11. It emphasised that symptoms of ASD may only be recognised as indicative of ASD in retrospect. And this disregards the possibilities of retrospective recall biases. And it may be the case that when an ASD diagnosis, it may be the case when an ASD diagnosis is experienced as less burdensome or stigmatising than other diagnoses. This can result in some people actively preferring an ASD diagnosis over other diagnoses, and particularly people who self-diagnose, who essentially, become circular. Because they're so convinced they have it, they won't be open to any other possibilities. And for them, it's just an identity. And if there's no actual evidence historically of real impairments, if you ask me, that could result in false positives. And there's low agreement between diagnosis based on retrospective interviews and those based on behavioural observations. And the other thing is that early predictive or well-established features of ASD, for example, deficits in joint attention behaviour, are not mentioned in the ICD11. And it also emphasises that the symptoms may be overlooked, overshadowed or compensated. With regard to differential diagnosis, the ICD11 emphasises that symptoms have to be persistent and pervasive with onset in early childhood, but the statements in the earlier sections that symptoms may be compensated, overshadowed, be presented by features of other disorders, or may only be recognised in retrospect, relativise this important condition. In contrast to DSM-5, the ICD11 allows a vast variety of possible symptoms, and this results in an operationalisation of ASD that is in favour of an extremely diverse picture at the expense of precision, with the aim to increase sensitivity for cognitively able and older individuals. Specificity is reduced, and the hope of finding valid biomarkers is hampered. As ICD11 defines ASD in a broad constellation of behaviours that can hardly be differentiated from other disorders, the risk of false positives increases. And since ICD11 draws particular attention to so-called high-functioning adults with ASD, concern that prototypical as well as low-functioning cases may become neglected in research, and the DSM-5 conceptualisation makes it much clearer that there has to be observable symptoms. So the DSM-5 focuses more on observable symptoms than ICD11, and the emphasis of compensation in ICD11 poses the risk that the value of standardised behavioural observations and interviews with caregivers might decrease, and criterion of an early onset of ASD be undermined. And an essential differentiation between ASD and autism-like traits that are present in many disorders could be threatened in ICD11. And by considering social traits a priori as autistic-like traits, any differentiation of mental disorders that are associated with social interaction problems becomes a lost cause. So the article says we need subtypes for tailored interventions, we need a more precise phenotyping in ASD, we need clearly defined, more objective criteria, we need to pinpoint for core ASD symptoms, and to provide rules for assigning overlapping symptoms to either ASD, co-occurring conditions or both, and we need to move beyond an increasingly diffuse unitary phenotypic spectrum concept towards precise symptom phenotyping. Essential to link symptom domains to neurobehavioural mechanisms, biological pathways and etiologies. We need to move towards precision medicine. So that's the article, so do let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.